Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Great Mind series. In this episode, we weave together threads of ancient wisdom from the profound teaching of Advaita with the insightful contributions of Professor Hoffman. As humanity has long sought answer to the great abyss of existence, today we stand at the intersections of time, a confluence where timeless existential truth and the lens of modern science converge. This is just not an academic discourse, but a dance between age-old wisdom and groundbreaking research. As we embark on this exploration together, let us remember, though our path may diverge in methods, our destination is one and the same, the very essence of being. Join us in this series on conscious reality, unraveling the mind. Welcome, Professor Hoffman, and Namaste, Swami Ji.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Ivy.
So we're gonna, Swami, we're gonna start with a questions, basically go through your personal experience before we go to the model itself. Could you both shed lights on your personal experiences and reflections that directed you towards your current philosophical and scientific perspective?
So I'm Swami Sarvapriyananda, and I'm a monk, a Hindu monk, and I belong to this particular Hindu order called the Ramakrishna Order of Monks. We broadly belong to a philosophy called Advaita Vedanta. That would be the umbrella of philosophy for us. Personal journey, I grew up in a small town on the east coast of India, near the Bay of Bengal. This is a town called Bhubaneswar. It's an ancient city called the City of Temples. My parents were spiritual seekers, 2, 3 generations, grandparents, and my parents also. So we had lots of books, especially books by Swami Vivekananda. And I think I'm probably the last generation before cable TV and internet, and also all we had were books. So I grew up reading lots of books. I was a bit of a bookworm. And what appealed to me was this message that that spirituality is real and it is experiential. One can experience it firsthand. And that is actually the purpose of life, spiritual enlightenment. And that really evoked something in me. And I decided that's what I'm going to do all my life. And I found out about being a monk afterwards. And I became a monk after I finished my education. So we'll talk about the philosophy behind it as we go along. But yes, this was the project. And I've been a monk for about 30 years now. And I guess I've refined my philosophical perspective over these decades.
Great. Very interesting. Well, so I grew up in Southern California. And my dad had a master's degree in chemistry and worked in tech industries for a while. My mom had a bachelor's in biology and was quite sharp. And my dad eventually became a minister in a fundamentalist Christian group, and it was quite striking. I mean, it was very, very strong that even other Christian groups were wrong, and it was very much we're right and everybody else is wrong, and Catholics certainly weren't going to make it to heaven, that kind of thing. And so I got that on weekends and Wednesday nights, because we also did Wednesday nights at the church. And but during the week, I got science at school that was suggesting a very different point of view. And so I, as a teenager, decided I wanted to answer the question, are we just machines? That was how I put the question to myself. It seemed like from a scientific point of view, we could say we were just machines. From the religious point of view in which I was being raised in, not. And so I wanted to find out what was going on there. And the science could do stuff. It could make technology, and the religion didn't seem to be doing anything. But on the other hand, it seemed like I wasn't a machine, and I wanted to. It seemed like both sides had something to offer and something that was a problem. So I decided to go into artificial intelligence and study human cognitive neuroscience to get both sides of this issue. So I went to MIT as a graduate student in the artificial intelligence lab from 1979 to 1983, and also in what's now the brain and cognitive science department. and did my PhD there. So really trying to understand, on the one hand, what it takes to build an artificial intelligence and ask the question, could they be conscious? But then also asking what, if anything, is special about humans? Are we just machines, or is there something special about us? And then, after getting my PhD at MIT, I've been then working on models of consciousness and perception, trying to bridge the gap between the point of view that we're sort of special, there's something interesting about us, and then also the formal point of view, from science, where you need to make your theories mathematically precise. And so I'm still working on that, and we'll probably go into some of the ideas.
If I could just step in there, an observation, what Don said about this crucial difference between science and religion. On one side, it seems to be that, to me, the way I put it is that science seems to have truth on its sides. Reality, it deals with reality and truth. And religion seems to have the advantage of talking about value, meaning, fulfillment, things like that. And they don't seem to be easily reconcilable. They don't seem to map too well into each other. And I was thinking, could consciousness be that point, the study of consciousness, a model which would incorporate both reality, truth on one hand, and also value, meaning, our inner life, or rich first-person experience, both? So just a thought.
I certainly absolutely agree with that idea. And I think that the scientists will eventually agree with it, because the mathematical models that my colleagues and friends who are in the sciences and developing this work, remarkably, I mean, these are really, really smart people. They're brilliant researchers. But if you ask them, what specific conscious experience can your scientific theory predict? Right. So, for example, integrated information theory. What specific pattern of integrated information must be the taste of chocolate, and could not be the smell of garlic, and for what principled reasons? What global workspace architecture or must be, again, the smell of a rose and couldn't be the smell of mint? What orchestrated collapse of quantum states of neuronal microtubules must be, the taste of chocolate couldn't be the taste of vanilla. I've asked my friends and colleagues specifically these questions, and they can't give an answer. They're batting zero. The only case where they might say we've made some progress is on the perception of space in integrated information theory. But there, if I ask, so is it visual space that you've shown, or is it auditory space or haptic space? Which space, and for what principled reasons must it be a visual space and couldn't be a haptic space? So there's nothing on the table in terms of specifics. So I say that to say that at some point, scientists are going to realize that this failure is principled, that you cannot start with unconscious ingredients or unconscious functional systems and somehow boot up consciousness. So that's the nice thing about science, is at some point, the failures trigger a revolution, a scientific revolution, and a change. So I think that science may do what you're talking about. It may trigger the sciences taking seriously the idea that consciousness may be a fundamental entity that we need to include in our scientific theories, and we need to describe it as such.
But that's really interesting, because the question which you put to your colleagues, I often face the exact mirror image, the exact opposite question, but a mirror image of the question. The question would be, what prediction can your theories of, the Vedantic theory of consciousness, or the Buddhist philosophies of consciousness, or any of the models of consciousness in ancient Indian philosophy make about the physical world, like which a scientific theory is supposed to, have predictive power. So that's interesting.
Well, and the question that you're raising does have a bite, right? I mean, from a hard-nosed scientist would say, great philosophy, whatever, Vedanta or whatever they'd say. But I'm interested in predicting the scattering amplitudes of protons inside of a collider. So can your theory tell me anything about that? And if not, then they're not terribly interested, right? So so they're going to want these. But I think that, again, a scientific theory of consciousness could bring the two sides together, the spiritual side and the science side, where we take the mathematical tools of the sciences and the insights of the spiritual traditions, meld them together into a scientific theory that will surprise both the scientists and the spiritual. I mean, that's the whole point, is that we end up realizing that something that we deeply believed was probably deeply wrong, and other things that we didn't suspect turn out to be more interesting than we'd ever thought. And we learn in that process. So I do see going forward that there can be mathematically precise models that capture some of the intuitions of the spiritual traditions in a precise way. And that eventually we won't have to refer to several thousand-year-old texts. We can refer to the new discoveries last week that we made in spirituality, because we now have a living, vibrant, scientific discipline of spirituality where we can actually move forward.
A little background. All the ancient Indian philosophies, and I want to make it clear that there's a whole spectrum of these points of view. There is not one philosophy or one theory of mind and consciousness. There are multiple theories, but all of them, they had their root in a central quest, and the quest was a quest for overcoming suffering, attainment of fulfillment, which were seen as fundamental human goals. So this was the quest. And when you try to do this, inevitably, you become interested in what is the self. Because after all, who is suffering, or who or what is looking for fulfillment? We need to understand that self, which wants to transcend suffering. And once you become interested in the self, you immediately become interested in the mind and in consciousness. So that's why all these philosophies, which are known as darshanas, darshana literally means to see. So multiple Buddhist schools, multiple Hindu schools, Jainism. So all of them, they evolved very sophisticated models of mind and consciousness, but with very interesting differences between them. Now I'm going to zoom in and focus on Advaita Vedanta, because I think it has something really special to offer. And of course, because it's my home tradition, it's the one which I'm most familiar with. Advaita Vedanta is based on a set of texts called the Upanishads, which are part of the most ancient Hindu texts, the Vedas. The Upanishads contain philosophical, spiritual teachings. And central thesis here is, I mean, one way I can put it, it's not the way they talk, but I would formulate it this way. All our experience of life is broadly subject and object. We are experiencer, and everything else is experienced, whether it's the sky and the trees outside, whether it's another human being, the computer, or whether it's my own sensations and feelings and memories. They're all objects of experience. So subject, object, this is the basic paradigm of all our first-person experiences. What Advaita Vedanta says is it collapses the duality, but it collapses the object into the subject. So it says the subject and object are actually not two. The interesting thing that Advaita wants to say, the surprising thing, if you will, is that quite counterintuitively, they're actually one. There is one underlying reality, which is now being experienced as subject and object. So that's sort of the basic idea behind all this. But the traditional way of teaching would be that we need to investigate ourselves. The Advaita has the advantage of being able to, you can put it in one sentence. These are called the so-called great sentences in Advaita. Most famously, Tat Tvamasi, which means that you are that. That would be the ultimate reality of the universe, which is existence, consciousness, bliss, and you are that. And if you would realize yourself, have a direct living experience of that, you would be set free from suffering, which is the original goal. Now, how do you do this? You do this by an investigation. All these philosophies, Advaita included, are very inside out. So They are what one might call in modern philosophical terminology phenomenological. You pay close attention to the elements of our experience and then reason about it. And then you come to these conclusions and these realizations. So Advaita Vedanta proceeds that way. Is first pay attention to yourself. And then, you're asked to consider what you think you are. And then Advaita proceeds to show us that you are gravely mistaken, or at least that is not the final answer. So we start off with the body. We think we are the body. And then Advaita tells us that consider the body, that, like how it changes. It gives us a battery of arguments. These arguments are not mathematical proofs. They're more like legal arguments, which are designed to persuade, sort of. So the body changes continuously, and you are the experiencer of the changing body. The changing and unchanging cannot be the same thing. So you cannot literally be the body. A more sophisticated argument would be, notice that you experience the body. You are the experiencer. You can see, hear, smell, taste. All the senses operate on the body. And the subject and object have to be different. That's sort of primary. So clearly you, the experiencer of the body, cannot be the body. Another even more sophisticated, subtle argument is, notice whatever you are, you always think of yourself as conscious, as aware. And notice that you are aware of the body. In your own experience, you are the one who's aware. The body is not aware. Like you're aware of the body. There is nothing in your experience which says the body is aware of you, this conscious self. So you cannot be the body. And then they go, turn your attention inwards, look at the breath. The breath is continuously changing. You are unchanging. The breath is an object. You are the subject. You are conscious. The breath is not conscious. You're conscious of the breath. For these and many other reasons, you cannot be the breath. When you convince yourself of this, look further inwards, you find the mind. Thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas, perceptions, memories, even this intellectual process which we're going through, this inquiry, all of them are also always changing, objects of experience, and you are conscious of them. This is where it becomes interesting, because in modern consciousness studies, we sort of take mind and consciousness together. But all these philosophies, all the ancient philosophies, Indian philosophies, are very clear on this, that even the mind is an object. So the way in Indian philosophy, the mind and the body are defined, object is defined as interesting. That which is experienced is an object, and the experiencer or the experiencing entity is the subject. So if you experience a tree, it's obviously an object. But if you experience a thought, an emotion, that's an object too. Only the two kinds of objects there's an interesting difference. The tree is a public object, which everybody will share the experience of that. But my own imagination or memory of the tree is unique to me and is private and first person. But nevertheless, objects. So even the mind is an object, and you are not the mind. And then we come to the, sort of speeding it up, you come to the conclusion that you are the pure subject, the non-objective subject. And that is not an entity among objects. That is that which is illumining these objects. And so far, this is called a philosophy called Sankhya, which is a clear dualism, still preserves the subject-object duality, but pushes the boundary back from the skin, back to the mind and the intellect. And the final step is taken in Advaita by, consider the nature of the object. What is its relationship to the subject? What is the relationship of what you experience to the experiencing consciousness? Are they truly different? So the Sankhyan philosophy would say they are different. There are two entities which interact with each other. Whereas Advaita says, the way you can consider one entity to be independent of the other is if they are experienceable separately. So, for example, the cloth and my body are separate because you can see the cloth without my body and you can see my body without the cloth. But obviously, you cannot experience an object without consciousness, because it's a trick question. It's sort of tautological because the very consciousness is built into the question. So therefore, you cannot say that objects experienced in consciousness are different from consciousness. Anyway, the final conclusion is whatever we are experiencing is basically consciousness appearing to itself in all these ways, in these various different ways. So you end up from the Sankhyan dualism to a non-dualism. Although here is this vast universe of multifarious objects, they do not constitute a countable second apart from consciousness. It's not a countable second, no second, non-dual. That's why the name comes non-dual. Advaita means non-duality. Anyway, how does all this help us? If this becomes a living reality, if you realize it as that, the world continues exactly as it was. Your body, mind, even your sense of self continues, but there's such a deep shift in your paradigm of understanding of what we are, what the world is. You immediately see that you are one with the world. The world is nothing but your own appearance. And that helps us transcend suffering. So the body dies, for example, this consciousness arguably does not die, and so on. So you are freed of the fear of death. You are freed of the problem that comes with the sense of separation of the other, hatred, fear, anxiety, desire, all of them disappear at an existential level because you know deep inside, I'm one with the so-called other. Anyway, so there are many implications of this. And so this is a very deep philosophical solution of the original problem of suffering. I'll just add one more thing which might be helpful. How do we go from the modern, let's say, sort of school child idea of the scientific idea of the world, what we learn in science at school, to this non-duality? There are obviously some huge philosophical steps that we have to take, each of which can be argued endlessly. But if I were to sum it up in a sentence or two, it would be this. We start with the physicalist, reductionist view of the world, this universe. And then we notice we cannot explain consciousness with this view of the world. You cannot reduce consciousness to the brain, so the so-called hard problem of consciousness. That opens the door to the next step, which is that consciousness is a fundamental reality of the world. So there are physical forces which are fundamental, and there's also consciousness which is fundamental and ubiquitous in some sense. That leads us to a dualism, which is very similar to the ancient Sankhyan dualism or the modern panpsychism, for example. Then the next step is taken is that this consciousness is not separate. These are not, its consciousness is not divisible. There are not multiple consciousnesses. It is actually one consciousness, which interacts with many, many body-mind complexes to become individual selves, but it's actually in the background, it's one consciousness. So that's the third step. And the last step would be what consciousness experiences, the material world, that's actually not fundamental. Consciousness is fundamental. So the material world is some sense and evolution or an appearance or like consciousness drawing a picture to itself or appearing to itself in those ways. So 4 steps. If one wants to go from a very reductionist, more scientific worldview to this non-dualist worldview, 4 huge steps have to be taken from the hard problem of consciousness to the consciousness matter dualism to one consciousness and to the non-duality of consciousness. Then you are at Advaita. And I know each of these are enormous steps to take in philosophy, let alone science.
That's a wonderful and very clear description. Thank you. And I like every aspect of that description. And so I'll now say from the scientific point of view, and by the way, not to say that I'm endorsing what I'm about to say, I'm just going to say what the current scientific point of view is that space-time is fundamental.
Yeah.
Right? That's the fundamental reality. That's been since Newton and probably before and then, well, it was space and time with Newton and then space-time with Einstein. And so objects inside space-time are taken to be fundamental. And then consciousness is taken to be a fairly latecomer in the evolution of this physicalist universe, right? And so the suffering is built in the sense that you are nothing but a little object, 100 to 200 pound object in space-time. And your consciousness, some of my friends and colleagues say that even your feeling that you have consciousness is an illusion. So consciousness is merely, all that's really going on is just brain activity, and you have the illusion of consciousness. Now, so that's been the framework of science. And so we've had this situation between science and spirituality where the frameworks couldn't be more different, right? They're very, very different. And the scientists were the ones who were making all the good technology and so forth. So they seem to have the upper hand. But now in the last 20 years, theoretical physicists who push the boundaries of science, especially in the physics, to the smallest scale, highest energies, are saying, many of them are saying, that space-time is doomed. And by that, they mean that space-time, which has been taken as the fundamental reality for science to build on, is not fundamental reality. So David Gross has said this, Nathan Seiberg, Nima Arkhani Hamed. And the reason they say this is not for spiritual reasons, but for technical reasons in their own theories, that if you, the very notion of space or space-time has no operational meaning beyond what's called the Planck scale, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters or 10 to the minus 43 seconds. So Einstein's theory of space-time in gravity, together with quantum theory, those theories together tell you not only the scope of the and power of the idea of space-time, but they also tell you the limits of that idea. And the limits are very precise. Space-time falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds. It no longer does any work for us. It falls apart. And the reason is, if you try to measure smaller and smaller regions of space, you have to use smaller and smaller wavelengths of light or whatever radiation that you're using to, in your microscope. And quantum theory tells us, in fact, Einstein told us that as you get smaller and smaller wavelengths, the energy goes up and up. But then Einstein also told us that energy and mass are the same thing. And his gravity theory tells us if you get too much mass into too small a region of space, you destroy the space. And so you would actually destroy the very object you're trying to measure. So that's what happens. I'm trying to measure a property of some physical object at 10 to the minus 44 centimeters. Well, the energy that's required is so high that when I actually try to do that, I destroy the very object that I'm trying to observe. So that's the power of science, though, right? The scientific theories are so mathematically precise that they tell you not just the scope of what they can do, but the limits of the very concepts. And so that's what's beautiful about the scientific approach. So we now know that space-time cannot be fundamental. And so that's the first step for science toward getting to it's like the first step along the steps that you were talking about, recognizing that space-time is not fundamental. The next step will be for them to understand that there's got to be something beyond space-time, right? As scientists, if space-time isn't fundamental, we need a theory that's more fundamental. So what are we going to posit that's beyond space-time, not curled up inside space-time like string theory and the extra dimensions in string theory, but literally beyond space-time. So that's what I'm working on, is a proposal in which consciousness and a mathematically precise Markovian dynamics of what I call conscious agents beyond space-time is what I'm proposing as the next step beyond space-time, as the quote-unquote next fundamental reality. Of course, my own view about science is that there will never be a theory of everything in science, and for very simple, principled reasons. A scientific theory, in its very structure, has assumptions. It says, if you grant me these assumptions, then I can explain all this other fun stuff. But I don't explain those assumptions. Those are my assumptions. I just assume those. Those are, so to speak, the miracles of my theory. You might say, well, that's not a problem because I can get you a deeper theory that explains those assumptions. Sure, but your deeper theory is still a scientific theory, so it has its assumptions. And so you have this endless regress of assumptions. And so our minds, our scientific theories, cannot be the final reality. Right. So this is also in concert with what you were saying, the difference between mind and consciousness. Mind is what produces these scientific theories. And in the very process of doing that, we recognized the limits. So there is, I think, an infinite intelligence. And mind is intelligent, but it's not, it's limited. We can never get a scientific theory of everything. And yet, the work that I'm working on right now suggests that in fact, we are consciousness, this non-dual kind of consciousness that you're talking about. And we can talk about how, with mathematical precision, some of the things that you were just discussing. So we'll be publishing a paper, we're working on a paper right now in which we actually talk about how one consciousness in this this Markovian dynamics of conscious agents can observe other consciousnesses. And it's something in Markov theory called taking a trace chain. And it turns out we can actually put what's called a partial order, a logic on all the possible consciousnesses in our theory and how consciousnesses observe each other by this trace chain process. It's a partial order. And so we'll be able to then begin to describe like the fundamental features of consciousness. Again, our models will only be models. As you were saying, I think correctly, consciousness will transcend anything that the mind can say about it. Ultimately, it will transcend it. And yet, we know that there's some virtue in trying to be mathematically precise in our statements about consciousness. The technologies that we're using right now to talk to each other would not be possible without. So even though I'm saying their scientific theories can never be a theory of everything, they're a theory of something. And they do rigorously capture things that are very, very interesting and useful. So I actually see that the mathematical framework that I'm working on right now is a first baby step, but precise baby step in a scientific theory of exactly what you were talking about. And the nice thing is then it would lead to, for example, the idea that space-time is just a virtual reality headset that some consciousnesses use. But it's just a headset. And so that's a complete flip from saying space-time is the fundamental reality to, no, it's just a particular user interface, a particular virtual reality headset. And as you were saying, when you die, you just take off that headset. But when you take off a headset, you just take off a headset. It's not the end of you, it's just the end of that particular headset. So I think that science, it's going to take a while because we're so used to thinking of ourselves as little objects in space-time. It's very, very hard for us to think out of that box. But that's where I think science eventually, kicking or screaming, a scientist will be dragged by the logic of their own theories to recognize that space-time is not fundamental, space-time is doomed, and that consciousness is fundamental and space-time is just a headset. But that we can still do a mathematically precise and rigorous description of consciousness beyond space-time, knowing all the time that our theory is not the reality, it's just a theory, and that we'll never have a complete theory of consciousness, but we will always have the next interesting baby step.
It was very evocative of different levels. For example, when you said space-time is just like a headset, I mean, that perspective, it's so stunning from an Advaita Vedanta viewpoint. Advaita Vedanta would say space, time, and object is the headset.
Right.
So there's literally an Upanishadic text which sort of is evocative of what you said. It says that the ultimate reality, consciousness, is not limited by time-space object. The exact Sanskrit sentence is Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. The ultimate reality, Brahman, is limitless existence consciousness. And the theory of limits in Advaita Vedanta is that things are limited in space, meaning they are localized in space. Things are limited in time, that means they are partitioned off in time, beginning and end, production and destruction, and so on. And then there's this idea of an object limitation. Things are exactly what they are and different from everything else. So something that is not limited by space-time object would be all-pervasive, because it's not limited by space. With respect to space, it would be everywhere. It would be eternal, because with respect to time, it would be eternal, though it's not in time. And with respect to object, it would be non-dual, because no object would be different from it. The idea of object limitation is each object is different from all. This is the very law of identity in logic. Everything is identical to itself and different from everything else. And Advaita disagrees. It says reality is actually that to which all objects are one with that, and it's not different from any object. So yeah, that would be the idea of ultimate reality in Advaita Vedanta. So yeah, but stepping back one step, what would be, from our perspective, from a spiritual, from a Vedantic perspective, our view of science? So one traditional perspective has been that, it's not necessary as far as enlightenment is concerned, freedom is concerned. These are all complete systems, and so you practice this, take up this worldview and practice this, and you'll be free, and you'll be free of suffering. But I don't agree with that for two reasons. First is because there are clearly multiple schools of thought. I may think, as I do, that Advaita Vedanta is the cat's whiskers, but I cannot deny there are very powerful schools of thought with different points of view on the same subject of enlightenment and freedom from suffering. There are multiple Buddhist schools of thought. There are other Hindu schools of thought. So that's one reason. And the second one, I think, is we live in an age of science, and science is the most powerful means of knowledge that humanity has ever come up with. It would not be wise to ignore science from even a spiritual perspective. I know that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is firmly on this side of that scientific investigation of whatever religion claims. Swami Vivekananda said that I'm firmly convinced that the claims of religion must be subjected to tests as rigorous as those of science. And if we have to get rid of something which fails the test, so much the better, because if something falls, which is no matter how comforting, if it's false, ultimately it cannot be good. We must get rid of it. I think we are all part of this age, and we cannot take anything ultimately very seriously unless it is endorsed with or put in the language of reason and science. And I also think that the pioneers of these systems, whether Shankaracharya, the Buddha, Nagarjuna, the kind of mind that we see in their writings, they would have been very impressed by science, and they would have, I'm sure not one of them would have ignored science. So these are the reasons why I think from a spiritual perspective, one needs to take scientific investigation of spiritual claims or philosophical claims seriously.
I would agree, and it gets to something that spiritual traditions talk a lot about, and that is that pointers are just pointers. Right?
Yes.
That don't take my words, like the Tao Te Ching says, the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. And yes. Once you understand that, then it's fine to go ahead and read the rest of the document, because they're just pointers. And the difference, the thing that science brings to the table is we know how to make precise pointers that tell you precisely both the scope and the limits of the pointers. Like, again, Einstein's theory of space-time. That's a beautifully precise pointer, and it tells you precisely when that pointer falls apart at the Planck scale, 10 to the minus 30. That one goes to pieces, and we need a new framework. And so that's what science can bring to the spiritual traditions. The spiritual traditions already said, our pointers are not it. And science says, you're absolutely right, they're not it. And here's how to make pointers that tell you they're not it and tell you precisely where they stop. And that's, I think, what science brings to the table and will really help in spirituality. It's not something to boast about that we're still doing and talking about the same documents that we had 3,000 years ago. Right. And then having different sections fighting over over the pointers.
Yes.
And they fight over the pointers and are dogmatic about certain pointers simply because the pointers themselves are not powerful enough to tell you their limits.
Right.
And so scientists are human beings and are dogmatic as anybody else on the planet. But science as a social institution says, when your theory tells you its limits, those are the limits. And it's time then to go beyond your particular theory and come up with a deeper framework. And so I see that spirituality, so it's an interesting situation. The spiritual traditions have been outside of space-time for thousands of years. They've been saying, yes, space-time isn't it, and we're already exploring. And science has been only studying our headset. They've been studying space-time, but they've been developing incredible tools since Galileo, incredible tools. We thought we were studying fundamental reality. No, we were just studying our little headset, one little headset that's possible. But in the process of doing that, we got these incredible tools. Now, just in the last 20 years, science is saying, wait, space-time isn't fundamental. We can use our tools to start to step outside of space-time. And we're finding stuff, by the way, something called decorated permutations and amplituhedron and cosmological. They're finding mathematical structures beyond space-time. and the work I'm doing on consciousness and Markovian dynamics of consciousness is a social network of consciousnesses outside of space-time. But that social network, the mathematics tells me that it unifies, that groups of conscious agents also constitute a single conscious agent. So there's this notion of unity. So the mathematics itself is pointing to the kinds of things that you're saying. It follows from the mathematical model. And I'm not saying my mathematical model is the final word, absolutely not. But it's a rigorous baby step outside of space-time in the direction that Advaita, Vedanta, and other groups are saying, that of consciousness being fundamental. So I see a rapprochement coming, and not just a rapprochement, but actually a synergy between the tools of science and the beautiful insights of the spiritual traditions looking outside of space-time, and both will be enriched, and both will be surprised, and both will have new things that they learn and things that they have to give up in the process.
Right. I remember Swami Vivekananda, who was the founder of our movement here in the United States. He got along famously with Nikola Tesla, I mean, the inventor, not the car. And they had amazing correspondence. This correspondence is still available. And Swami Vivekananda was convinced that science could explain or support or throw light on the certain claims of ancient Indian philosophies. But probably the physics of the day was not advanced enough to come to any kind of conclusion. I don't think they got anywhere particularly. I mean, but Tesla himself was fascinated with Vedanta. And Vivekananda made a comment about this nature of fanaticism in religion. And he said to the question that, look, science continuously keeps on revising itself. Science seems to be very shaky. He said that if science and religion are weak, then a body of priests is weaker still. So, yeah. And I think the real problem comes when you don't treat these claims of or these philosophies as pointers, and you treat them as truth. And then they are not compatible, and they are not verifiable. And so you treat them as truth, and then the next result is fighting, hatred, then the tribal instinct kicks in, so in-group and out-group, and all this problem starts.
I completely agree, and that is one of the most important things that we're talking about, is that our theories are just theories. They're just pointers, and that's in science and in spirituality, and to not be addicted to our theories. But I grew up in the Christian spiritual tradition, where that wasn't observed. It was our way or the highway. We know the truth, and our interpretation of the truth is it. And if you don't believe that interpretation, you won't end up in heaven. And a lot of other groups were not going to end up in heaven as a result.
That's an interesting distinction. That's where I think for the Indian experience, there's something worthwhile to learn from the Indian experience. They had the same thing. They were a very, very religious country for nearly 4,000 to 5,000 years. But there wasn't, for a very long time, there isn't any record of any kind of violence based on religion. It was not a peaceful country. I mean, there were wars and empires rising and falling, but none of them throughout known history until modern times, until the coming of Islam and missionary Christianity. Until that time, violence predicated based on religion was virtually unknown. Now, the reason is they understood that these are pointers, or rather they used a path metaphor, that these are different paths. One of the most ancient teachings in the Upanishad says the truth is one, but the wise speak of it differently. So it's interesting that you can formulate the truth in different ways, and you are wise when you formulate it. It's not that you're unwise or you're ignorant. The wise speak of it differently. And so a variety of philosophies developed. I mean, there was tremendous freedom to think in your own way and come up with newer pointers or better ways. And they disagreed intensely. It's not that it was all sweetness and harmony, but they developed a very interesting system called Vada, which means debate. So you had experts in different philosophies, and they would get together. So the experts would get together a bit like a peer group, and they would debate it out among themselves, which spared the general population and the politicians and the kings, no violence based on that.
Right.
Yeah, so that's an interesting insight.
Perfect. I really like that. So we're on the same page.
I remember an American Swami, an American monk. I said, he came from a background very similar to what you described. He was in North Carolina, I think. He said in the 60s, when he became a monk, he said, I grew up religious, but I noticed that we were told that whatever was taught in our little churches, right, and all the churches, including the one across the street, they're all going to go to hell. They're all wrong. And
Right.
he felt, well, maybe then this one is wrong too. That would be the logical conclusion to come to. If everybody in religion is wrong except my little point of view, then it's probable that this is going to be wrong too. And he said, for a long time, I lost interest until I came to this idea, this Indian idea that all of them are right. In certain ways, they all are pointing to the same truth. That really sort of inspired.
Yeah, the different perspectives, which is an important point of view, I think. We can take different perspectives on something.
Yeah.
And this notion of perspective, see, the truth transcends any particular description of it. And so any description is just going to be a perspective, and they'll be useful for certain things and not useful for others. In the work that I'm doing on consciousness beyond space-time, the dynamics that we have doesn't have an arrow of time. It's a dynamical system, but the entropy doesn't need to increase. So there's no thermodynamic arrow of time. But it's a straightforward theorem that if you take that dynamics and make a projection of it, by just losing a little bit of information, like by conditional probability, the dynamics that you see in projection will necessarily have an arrow of time as an artifact of the projection process. And so you get the second law of thermodynamics, and you get the arrow of time as an artifact of our headset, not an insight into the nature of reality. Also, I think the projection from this consciousness beyond space-time into a headset full of objects. So my headset is full of all these objects that seem separate from each other, when in fact the consciousness, the network itself, is in some sense one network. So you're taking this one network, which is unified, and dividing it into all these little objects. So the idea then is that much of what we're seeing inside space-time, separate objects, an arrow of time, organisms competing for resources and fighting and killing, all of that is an artifact of a projection from a deeper reality in which there is no arrow of time, there are no limited resources, and there is no competition. So but the nice thing is that we can, so I love evolutionary theory, right? It's clear I'm talking about evolutionary theory, the competition and so forth. My book, The Case Against Reality, is mostly about evolution by natural selection, using the wonderful tools of evolutionary game theory to explore our perceptions. It's an incredibly powerful theory inside the framework of space-time. There's no rival to it, and it's incredibly powerful for understanding human behavior, understanding the evolution of organs. So I have nothing bad to say about evolutionary theory. It's one of our best scientific theories. But that theory itself tells us that space-time isn't fundamental. I've published some papers on that that use evolutionary game theory to show that space-time and object can't be fundamental from the point of view of evolutionary theory itself. And so what we have to do instead is to think about evolution as a scientific theory that's wonderful in the context of a certain projection, but it's not true of the deeper reality, say, of a network of conscious agents. And this will be true of all of our scientific theories. They're true in a projection. So they are, as we're in the other language, they're wonderful pointers. They're nice, precise pointers in a particular description of this deeper reality, but they're not the final reality. And I do want to raise a question that comes out of this science and spirituality interaction, and that is, if there is this one deep consciousness, but just the one, when you're talking about the final non-dual,
okay,
as a scientist, of course, I'm going to ask, so why should that one consciousness put on all these different headsets? I mean, I'm assuming that space-time is just one of them. I presume that it's perhaps one of the more boring ones, frankly. It's only 4 dimensions. Why not 500,000 dimensions? Why not 1 trillion dimensions? I mean, so as soon as you start to think out of the box, you realize we're probably in one of the cheaper headsets that consciousness And this is not, far from being the final reality, it's probably one of the more boring headsets that are out there that we're stuck in right now. And when we think it's the final reality. So there's a deep question that, I think the spiritual traditions would want to face, and probably are facing, and as a scientist working on this, I would want to face, and that is why is there a principled reason why the one would put on headsets that involve suffering? What is going on there? It's not stupid. It's doing it for a reason, right? There's got to. So I would love to hear your point of view on it, and I can try to say some words from a logical scientific point of view, but I'd love to hear your view.
Swami Ji, before you continue, did Upanishad say that the ultimate reality is the universal mind, right? And don't say consciousness just put on a headset and multiple headsets. So I just want to hear your point of view. Is it a universal mind, like Bernardo Castro positing as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So two questions. I'll take your Ivy's question first, and then Don's question about the ultimate why. But before that, let me just remark that what I find exciting about what Don is saying is that it seems to be, he's not speaking Advaita Vedanta, but he seems to be, from my perspective, talking about it in a mirror image, almost exactly the same thing, but he's coming at it from a scientific and philosophical perspective. And that too, not from one end of science. It's not just particle physics or not just evolutionary science, but evolutionary science, cognitive science on one end, and fundamental physics on the other end, and all tied together by mathematics on both sides. So that's really powerful. And it's exciting that it seems to be pointing in the same direction or painting a picture which is very similar to what Advaita Vedanta says. That's really exciting. The only thing is I'm a little scared of, the sheer depth and complexity of thought. I'm not smart enough to grasp it. I think what Don has been doing, thankfully, is giving us, to use your famous desktop analogy, that if you can't handle the reality as it is, but the desktop of a computer helps you to handle the computer. You couldn't handle the actual machine directly. So the desktop is not the machine, but so what Don is, I think, doing is giving us the desktop version of very complex and very subtle scientific investigations he's engaged in. Okay, the two questions. First, Ivy's question does Advaita Vedanta say the ultimate reality is a cosmic mind? Yes and no. According to Advaita Vedanta, the ultimate reality is, it's easily understood in the model of our own individual personality. So we have a body, here's a physical body, but we also have a mind, thoughts, feelings, emotions, ideas, knowledge, memories, intentions. And Advaita, Sankhya, all these philosophies would say, beyond body and mind, we are also consciousness. So consciousness and mind are distinguished on the principle that mind is still an object to consciousness. Okay. Right. Now, what Advaita Vedanta says about ultimate reality, not about yourself, but the entire universe, is that, so there is this one consciousness with the power of causality, time, space, and causality. That consciousness, it's a power, time, space, causality, like a headset. That consciousness is now called Saguna Brahman, which is roughly translated to the God of religion, the God which creates this universe. Then one step further, projecting further outwards, that consciousness with the power of time-space causation, and the power of time-space causation has a name. It's called Maya. The headset has a name, Maya. Yeah. So consciousness with Maya now projects itself as a cosmic mind, which includes all of our minds, and it's like a universe-wide network of minds. So, so consciousness, Maya, or the headset, and cosmic mind. So in that sense, ultimate reality is cosmic mind, though not in the most fundamental sense. In the fundamental sense, it's non-dual consciousness. The next step would be non-dual consciousness plus the headset, which is nothing but a projection of that non-dual consciousness. The next step would be the cosmic mind. And then the next step would be the universe, which is treated like the body of that cosmic, that pure consciousness. Okay. So 3 levels, reality, and then 3 levels. One is the causal level, the subtle level, and the physical level. The causal level is time-space causation. The subtle level is cosmic mind, and the physical level is the universe, this universe.
Okay. Right.
That's the sort of framework. And Advaita would insist the only reality is actually that non-dual consciousness. And the other 3, they would put at a lower level of reality as a projection, like maybe a screen and a movie, like that. Then, but deeper, I can connect this to why. Why at all would it do this? And a secondary question would be, why particularly this? As you said, the sort of cheap version of time-space causation. Why
Right.
this? And why suffer? Things like that. There are multiple answers depending on the school of Vedanta you go to, but Advaita Vedanta, I think it has the most philosophical answer. And their answer is very interesting. The answer is the question itself is wrong. The question is wrong. Why is the question wrong? Because when you ask a question, why, when we ask why, what answer are we expecting? It's an answer which starts with because. So we are already assuming causality. We assume causality, and Advaita Vedanta says the ultimate reality is not causally linked with this universe. Causality plays within this universe, but the ultimate reality is not causally linked. This universe appears because of that ultimate reality. But ultimate reality, from its perspective, has no causal link with the universe. It's like asking, why did the hero do heroic things, or why did the villain do terrible things in the movie? But the screen of the movie is not causally connected with the plot of the cinema. But the screen enables the entire thing to happen. The whole movie depends on the screen. But the screen, you can't question the movie screen. Why did you do such terrible things? Or why did you do such heroic things? The screen will say, I didn't. From my perspective, none of that happened really. So because in between you have the headset, Maya, and causality is within Maya. So causality is not linked to the ultimate reality. It's like asking what's outside space. But then you've already assumed space. Inside and outside are space terms. It's like asking what's before time. But you've already assumed time if you ask before and after. So similarly, asking why this universe, you've already assumed causality, in which case the chain of causality will start working. If you push further and ask, why this particular universe? Why does it work out this way? There, Vedanta, I think that's one of the beautiful points of Vedanta, is that ask the scientist. They are the experts in this. Why the universe evolved in the particular way it did. Why is life like this? Evolution at the level of life and cosmic evolution at the level of the universe. Those are the answers we have to look for. They're all within causality. I don't know if that makes any sense. I can deal with another version of this question, which is, it goes back to the whole science and spirituality thing. I think it was Sam Harris who put it this way. Look, he says, consciousness seems to have epistemic primacy. To know anything, there must be consciousness, to at least have the first person experience. But time, space, matter seems to have ontological primacy. Even consciousness has to exist first to be able to give you first person experience. So there is the question to Advaita, the question which I face in the most philosophical form would be, we understand the importance of consciousness as far as our whole life is concerned, as far as everything is, experiencing things are concerned. But why should epistemic primacy translate into ontological primacy? Why should, your first person experience, consciousness is absolutely necessary, but why would it mean that consciousness is the fundamental reality of the universe? So that's the question. I think that's where Don's investigations come in. A more powerful scientific answer that consciousness cannot be dismissed from ontology, but the most fundamental kind of ontology, the whole universe itself.
The non-dual consciousness being the fundamental reality, there is a concomitant of that in our theory of conscious agents, where we have to write down what's called a probability space before we can even have a Markovian dynamics where there are actual experiences or thoughts or anything, we have to write down what we call a probability space structure. And so that sort of is the mathematical representation of this non-dual consciousness. There is no experience, there are no thoughts, there are no mind. There's just this potential for all of that. But the potential is its own thing. It's not a particular mind, it's not a particular thought. It's just when we first wrote down the theory, I didn't even think about that aspect of it. I knew I just had to write down a probability space, so I wrote it down, didn't even think about it, and went on to study the dynamics on it. But it was years later that I went back and go, so what does that probability space by itself mean? And I realized it's pointing to something that the spiritual traditions call this non-dual fundamental reality beyond us. So we get some pointers. I'm not saying again that this pointer is the right pointer or the final pointer, but it's an interesting pointer to, we can use the pointer of non-dual fundamental reality. That's one pointer to point to it. Or we can say a probability space prior to any particular thoughts or experiences popping up on that probability space. And that's another pointer that gives us some technical tools that we can start to use to explore, as long as we recognize that the tools are just tools and not the final reality, right? So as long as we recognize in our science that we fundamentally we're deeply ignorant, right? No description can ever be it by a long shot, and yet we can have better descriptions, more precise descriptions. And so in that humble spirit is offering these mathematical. But then in terms of the deep question, about why would the non-dual project itself into a particular headset and have suffering and so forth, I agree that trying to use notions of causality is a category error in some sense when you're dealing with that question. But you could also, though, ask, instead of causal, could I ask this as a logical question, not a causal question, but a logical question? And so the kind of logical statement, there are two directions that we might, explore. One might be, if, as I heard one spiritual teacher say, if everything were green, then green would be meaningless. Right? In some sense, the only way to know is by contrasts. So the non-dual, just one logical direction that we might be interested in is for the non-dual to know itself as non-dual, it needs to plunge itself into duality and experience suffering, which is the identification with the duality, and then the gradual process of letting go of the duality, which is very painful and hard, but it ultimately, and that whole process is essential for the non-dual to really deeply understand itself as non-dual. It had to go through the suffering otherwise you can't. So again, I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying that that's an interesting logical direction that could be explored. And there may be maybe other, I'll just mention one other logical direction that would be fun to explore. And that is, it's a theorem that no system, like a computer system, can fully represent itself to itself. So if I have a computer system and I want it to, quote unquote, understand itself, it would have to build a model of itself. Well, in the very process of building a model of itself, it's become more complicated. So now it's got a more complicated entity that it needs to model. So it's going to build a more complicated model. You see, we get into an infinite regress. So this is, again, a kind of logical, not causal, but logical argument. And again, I'm not saying it's the final word, but it's an interesting pointer to maybe the non-dual fundamental reality makes all these headsets as models of itself, and the process is never ending because for these logical reasons. So again, I'm just pointing, these are not causal, but they're logical. And ultimately, I think maybe a reply to my itch here is to say, you can't scratch that itch because ultimately you're trying to use reason. So logic is part of reason. You're trying to use reason, which is a finite well, it's potentially infinite, but not this kind of infinity. The non-dual is an infinity that maybe transcends the powers of reason. One might try to go there and say, so even this logical kind of argument would fall prey to the kind of thing you were saying, to the causal, in the sense that even logical still, in some sense, will fail to probe the true depths of this unconditioned non-dual reality. I don't know what you think about that, but
No, that sounds amazingly, like, again, the mirror image. It's almost exactly like a Vedanta teacher would say, but from the outside in, from a logical, scientific perspective, philosophical perspective. From this is inside out. I'm reminded of a statement from the Mundaka Upanishad, which goes, "The uncaused cannot be attained by the caused." So nothing that you do here will result in infinity. But you are the infinity, and knowledge will reveal to you that you are that infinite. From a logical perspective, if you ask why, let me give you a third alternative. What struck me inside out is, when you ask why would it do this at all, the logical answer would be, well, there are only two logical possibilities. Either it remains as the non-dual absolute and projects nothing at all, or it remains as the non-dual absolute and projects something. And it's doing both. If you look at our own personal experiences, in waking and dreaming, we experience objects. In deep sleep, we have a blankness. And that is now projected to the cosmic level. So the ancient Hindu idea of the cycle of the cosmos. So there's a projection of the universe, there's a sustenance of the universe, and there is an ultimate dissolution or destruction of the universe. So when the universe is here, there are, from fundamental particles to living beings to galaxies and all of that. And when the universe is finally destroyed, there is nothing, there's no thing. But it's not that it's empty. It's that ultimate reality is still there, empty of projection. And then the projection starts all over again. But my point here is, there are logically, strictly only two possibilities. To the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, both are presented to you. Something is presented sometimes and nothing is presented other times. And what could the poor ultimate reality do except these two logical possibilities, presenting both anyway? I mean, if nothing was presented, theoretically, we could still ask the question, what a useless ultimate reality? Why doesn't it do something? And when it does something, we can ask, why is it doing this? So logically, only two things are possible, and both are being presented. Presentation of something to consciousness and presentation of nothing to consciousness. Another much oversimplified example we sometimes use is gold and ornaments. You can either have the gold in a variety of ornaments, or you can have no ornaments, melted down to gold itself. And in both cases, gold remains gold. It's just new names and forms evolve, or there is no name and form.
Makes sense. And I would just add that, the itch that I have, as a scientist, to get these logical or mathematical descriptions. And even though I know fundamentally that there's limits to descriptions, they can never. Still, I want to ask these questions about, and you gave a good reply on that. But it's interesting that we, from this point of view, in which the non-dual point of view, in which fundamentally what I am is the non-dual consciousness. That's what I really am, and I don't know it through logic and reason. I just know it by being it. I am that, and so it's this first person being. And so my questions are basically, in some sense, the one saying, who am I? Well, right.
Exactly.
Who am I? And in doing that, I can get descriptions using logic and reason and science and mathematics. But if I want to know it more deeply, then it's the meditation. Effectively, it's letting go of all thought. Right, I let go of all thoughts and just face myself naked, without any cloak of thoughts or logic or science or anything like that. And that is the deepest and from a scientific point of view, then I'll just say one thing. I know you want to say something here. We have this notion of Bayesian inference in science, where I have my prior assumptions, and based on those priors in the data, then I come to posterior conclusions. And we think about the brain, in fact, as some kind of predictive processing machine, where we have prior models that we're trying to see if they still fit, and we get data and we make conclusions about reality and so forth. But in some sense, what we're saying here is that at the deepest level in meditation, what you're doing is letting go of all Bayesian priors and just being without any models whatsoever. So again, it gets at this itch about why science, why headsets, and so forth. And I like your answer. I mean, it's, as far as logical answers go, we may not be able to get any deeper than that. But anyway, but these other scientific perspectives on it, and Bayesian inference and letting go of Bayes and so forth, are fun other ways of looking at this whole process.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I'll bring in three very ancient commentators. One is Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras. He said exactly what Don was saying right now, that if you can shut down these projections, sit down quietly, shut out the sensory activity, and shut down thinking, the internal thinking, remembering, desiring, intentionality, even in intellectual investigations. And then the claim is that this consciousness that you are will reveal itself to itself, not even to the mind, because the mind is shut down there. And there are this whole technologies of meditation, very detailed descriptions of what you do. And the claim is that many people have experienced this. So this is one. The second one comes from Shankara, the great commentator on Advaita Vedanta. He makes this beautiful observation that not just in deep meditation, once you know what you are, with eyes open also, for putting on the headset also, it's a difference between forgetting who you are and becoming absorbed in the projections of the headset, and then realizing who I am. Oh, I am this. Then you can go back into the headset and you're perfectly fine. So this is an ancient debate between the yogi and the Advaitin. The yogi says, wipe it out, settle down, stay there. And the Advaitin says, once you have recognized what you are, through this inquiry and meditation, then when you open your eyes also, it's perfectly all right. You can be in the middle of the projection. You can live your life as this enlightened, liberated being. And that would be the culmination of this entire process of evolution to this point, through all the suffering, through all the inquiries and pointers. Once you've got it, then let it be. Let this go on. And the third one I want to bring in is Shankara's guru's guru, Gaudapada, who sort of gave the final word on this original question which Tom asked, why at all? This question of why. His answer, which I like, is that's the very nature of that ultimate reality. He calls it the shining reality. The very nature of the shining reality is to shine. That's what it is. And how does it shine? It shines forth in various ways, like this universe, for example.
Very, very nice. I like that. And it also suggests this other metaphor about the spiritual ideas and suffering and so forth from the headset point of view. If I'm in the virtual reality, I can be, if I'm just like in a virtual reality shoot 'em up game, right? If I'm identified with my avatar in the game, I'm going to be quite scared because I'm identified with that, and things are happening inside that game that could destroy my avatar. Since I'm identified, that is me, I'm not relaxed. I'm suffering. But if I am in the game and I know it's a game and the avatar is just an avatar and I'm not identified with it, then I can enjoy the game, as you were saying, and I can participate in it and I can learn in the game. And so in some sense, from this metaphor point of view, the spiritual traditions are just telling us, recognize that this is, your body's just an avatar in the headset, and that's not who you are.
The avatar, in fact, is an ancient Sanskrit word. It means the descent of the non-dual consciousness into individual sentient human beings. So literally that. And there's one distinction. In a traditional dualistic religion, avatar would be only the descent of God, the God of religion, into human form. But in non-duality, in Advaita, all of us are avatars. We are all the manifestations of our real nature being non-dual consciousness, and our avatar nature being these forms and these activities.
That's right. And then I would agree with your conclusion that once we recognize that doesn't mean we throw off the headset. It means
Right.
now we can live for as long as we're supposed to within the headset, but with a different consciousness about the whole experience and learning
Exactly.
somehow.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense.
And one more advantage of this perspective is, there are these two approaches in religion, extending the headset analogy further. If, as a religious teacher, one makes claims about the contents, the projections in the headset, then one entirely on the basis of an ancient text or some belief system, then one runs headlong into the work of science, and then this clash starts. Ken Wilber said one of the things that religion has to do in the 21st century to hold on to people, especially young people, is that it has to stop contradicting established science. So that's where religion is making claims about the projections in the headset, which is entirely the domain of science, but science is much more powerful, much more precise. And that's the beauty of Advaita. It does not actually make claims about what's happening in the projection itself. It's
Right.
sort of plug and play. You can plug in ancient cosmologies of fire, earth, water, air, or you can plug in, quarks and string theory. Advaita would be comfortable with both.
Right. Yeah. When I was growing up and I was hearing from my spiritual tradition, the Christian, that at least that version that my church taught, the earth was only 4,000 or 5,000 years old. And that, that's just nonsense. Right? From the headset point of view, that's just nonsense. And so you're right. Spiritual traditions can't ignore, contradict the science, even though it's just the science of the headset. You got to get the headset. If you can't get the headset right, then why should I believe you about what's beyond the headset?
Exactly.
In some sense. But now, I should now say, for me as a scientist, and for my scientific colleagues listening to this kind of conversation, it's a nice kumbaya kind of thing here going, with science and spirituality. But, Don, where's the beef, right? You're talking about, if you have this theory of consciousness outside of space-time, where's the scientific beef? What specific theories do you have, and what specific new predictions can you make inside space-time? If you don't have that, Hoffman, the kumbaya stuff is, we're not interested. You get back to us when you can actually, and I completely, of course, as a scientist, respect and agree with that. And what my team is working on right now is trying to address exactly that. So we're using the theory of conscious agents and Markovian dynamics, and we're trying to show that we can predict precisely the what are called the momentum distributions of quarks and gluons inside protons at very high energy. So various, what they call Bjork and X and Q squared, basically the spatial and temporal resolutions that the colliders have examined inside the proton. I'm hoping to use a theory of conscious agents outside of space-time with a mathematically precise projection into space-time to get the exact momentum distributions. And I take it that if I can't, then my theory shouldn't be taken seriously. But if I can do that, if we can do that, that doesn't mean we're right. It just means that we have a shot at being an interesting next baby step outside of space-time. So I just want to, the kumbaya is great, but as a scientist, my colleagues are going to say, where's the beef? And so I want to say, I understand we need the beef, and we're working towards it. And where we are right now is the deepest structure that the physicists, the high energy physicists, have found beyond space-time are these decorated permutations. And we found a way of projecting our Markovian dynamics of consciousness onto decorated permutations. But it turns out that, and we did that on purpose because they have decorated permutations outside of space-time. So we'd like to project decorated permutations because we might be able to bridge through their decorated permutations and then get into space-time. Because what they've found is with these decorated permutations outside of space-time, they can predict precisely the scattering amplitudes for particles in space-time. So they've done that. They can do that. Not for all processes, but most processes now. And it turns out it's simpler. When you let go of space-time, the mathematics become simpler, and you see new symmetries that you couldn't see in space-time. So what we're trying to do is we have projected our dynamics into these decorated permutations, but ours are a richer. Our dynamics is much, much richer. They're dealing with what we call positive Grassmannians. We're dealing with Markov polytopes, and they're much more complicated. So what we're working on right now is how do we get the decorated permutations that come from our theory, which are far more complicated, and project them down to the more simple kind of decorated permutations that then lead to scattering in space-time. So, and if we can't do that, then scientists shouldn't take us seriously. But if we can, then we have a candidate for a baby step outside of space-time. So I just want to, all of our agreement is great, but ultimately I agree the hard-headed scientists are right until we actually can start with the theory of conscious agents and predict, say, scattering events in space-time. There's nothing to take seriously. And I just mentioned, you might say, well, why would you target quarks and gluons inside protons for your I mean, clearly the neural correlates of consciousness are more clearly in the brain. Why don't you just go and try to model, neural correlates of consciousness in the brain, like area V4 is correlated with color perception and MT with motion perception and so forth. And the reason is it's too complicated. The brain is a really complicated thing. If I can't first show that I can just get something simple like quarks and gluons inside of protons, forget the brain. I mean, if I can't even get quarks and gluons, I've got many, many steps inside the headset before I get up to the complexity of the brain. So I'm going after not what I think is necessarily the most interesting, but it's the most accessible part of the space-time headset that I could try to model. And if I can get quarks and gluons, then we can climb up to, nucleus, and then atoms, and then molecules, and then neural systems, and then maybe the brain, in terms of getting the map. So again, I of course am aware of the neural correlates of consciousness, and there are important constraints, but targeting directly from the theory of conscious agents to that, I think, is not a wise move scientifically. You will be waving your hands and having just so stories for a long, long time if you just do that. I want precise data predictions.
So, Swami Ji and Don, so where might your definition converge or might be diverge, though? So did you come to agree on both definitions?
I think we have to be very careful about saying that we agree. I mean, if we straight away agree, it's not a very valuable agreement. Yeah. It just sounds similar. Yeah.
Yeah. Audience been pushing that question. They've been asking a lot of questions, so they're pushing this question. They want to know where is the definition converge and where is it diverge. All of them want to hear from both of you.
Right. I asked this question to Brian Greene, who's a cosmologist at Columbia. He was launching his book, I think, Until the End of Time, which is more metaphysical than physics. So he was doing it at Harvard University, and at the book talk, I asked him, these theories, cosmological theories in the Upanishads, how do you relate them to modern understandings? And he said something very insightful. He said, look, these theories in Vedanta, and they are not scientific technically, but they seem to be poetic renderings of certain insights that we are getting in cutting edge science now. So that's from Brian Greene.
Yeah, I think so. I think that they're more than just poetic. I think that there's been some hard won insights from years of meditation and deep thought. So it's beyond poetry. But I would say that yes, I think at top level there is enough commonality of the ideas that it's worth pursuing. In the sense that I, as a scientist, would be well advised to listen to the insights from Advaita, Vedanta, and other spiritual traditions, again, with the same grain of salt that I give to any of my scientific colleagues and their theories, right? You have to be hard-nosed about everything. But being hard-nosed and being closed-minded are two different things. And so absolutely be hard-nosed, but and if someone was just talking nonsense, then I wouldn't even bother to try. So what I'm saying is it's clear that we're saying things that are very, very similar at top level. And so the insights that come from the spiritual traditions, I would be a fool to ignore them as a scientist, because I think that they're hard-won insights. And I would be a fool also to take them at face value, like I'd be a fool to take any scientific theory at face value. So there's hard work ahead, but the fact that there's enough agreement that it's worth doing that work is what's exciting to me.
Let me give you a specific example, not from science, but from the modern philosophy of mind. So when I studied the modern philosophy of mind, uh, the the basic course, the 101 course which people get in university now, one immediately gets the impression that it's a field which has stalled. The last person who said something major breakthrough would be Descartes more than 300 years ago, that cogito ergo sum, the mind-body dualism which he set up. And that's still the paradigm which we're still struggling with in the modern philosophy of mind. If you look at the papers and the philosophy of mind, the last 100 years, they neatly fall into two categories. There's one category trying to reduce mind and consciousness to neural activity, or to language, or to behavior, or some permutation of this, or to information lately. And there's another group of papers which say, sorry guys, it doesn't work. Whether it is, what it's like to be a bat, or Thomas Nagel's paper, or many other papers since. The paper about Mary seeing red for the first time, the color red, and so on. So this is where it is at. And my suggestion is that in order to break this deadlock and make some progress in the philosophy of mind, the insights of ancient Indian philosophy, I'm quite sure they'll be very helpful. I'm not just saying Advaita Vedanta. There are a number of Buddhist schools which I know have very powerful insights into mind and consciousness. So that's one area when we can dialogue can lead to progress. It's a very limited area, just the philosophy of mind itself.
That's right. No, I completely agree with that. And and the philosophy of mind is also intersecting with the science of mind, and so that the science of mind can also help. And here you see Irvine, we actually have a lot of interactions between philosophy and science. We have a department that looks at that. And I agree, but I also agree that much of the current philosophy of mind and the science of mind is physicalist and reductionist or functionalist, and none of it, as we've said, none of it can give us. No theory can give us a mathematically precise account of any specific conscious experience. In terms of actually giving me a theory of the taste of mint, the smell of garlic, a headache, when asked the philosophers of mind and also the scientists who are trying to understand consciousness, give me a specific example that your theory takes care of. There's literally nothing that they can do. And at some point, that failure, it will cause a revolution. When they realize that the failure is principled, it will cause a revolution. And by the way, almost none of my colleagues in cognitive neuroscience and studying consciousness, almost none of them understand what's happening in high energy theoretical physics, that space-time is doomed. Many physicists don't know. I was in a conference a few months ago where there were a number of quantum theorists presenting their theories of consciousness. And I made a point at the end of several of them, of their talks, to ask them, well, what do you think about the work in high energy particle physics, theoretical physics, that says the space-time is doomed? And none of them had heard of it. So these are PhDs in physics. So my colleagues in cognitive neuroscience studying consciousness can be forgiven if they don't know about this. But the train is coming and it's going to wreck that whole program. The space-time being doomed is a huge train wreck for basically all of the current theories in the philosophy of mind, most of the theories in the philosophy of mind, and basically almost all the theories in cognitive neuroscience and artificial intelligence for consciousness. And we're seeing some tremors, earthquakes in the field right now. There was a group just a couple of weeks ago who put out a paper, more than 100 signatories, saying that one theory, integrated information theory, was what they called pseudoscience. So there's already the failures to produce any specific models of any specific conscious experiences are starting to lead to problems inside the field, I think. And at some point they'll realize that an actual paradigm shift is required, that functionalism and reductionism and physicalism all disappear when you realize that space-time is doomed. And the physicists are the ones who are telling us space-time is doomed. So it's time for us consciousness researchers to get with the program and start to think outside of space-time. Or we're just going to be the dinosaurs that are laughed at in the history books.
I think where science and philosophy and spirituality are agreed is, on this point, Patricia Churchland, she said, I remember reading her saying that we don't need philosophy to understand consciousness. We just need to do more neuroscience, and you keep doing neuroscience and you'll understand consciousness. That's what now we are beginning to see is not right. Scientists, philosophers of mind, and philosophers in the field of spirituality, we are sort of coming to this conclusion that just a physical investigation of the brain will not solve the question of consciousness.
I agree. So it's not to say that we shouldn't do neuroscience. Of course, we need to do the neuroscience, but that's not going to be the final answer. In fact, neuroscience, in my view, needs more funding because it's far more complicated than the neuroscientists realize. They think that when you look inside a brain and you see neurons, that's the truth. That's the reality. No, that's just an interface projection of something that's far more complicated outside of space-time. We have to reverse engineer what we see in the brain, the neurons and the neural networks and the dendrites and the synapses and all that stuff. That is complicated as it might seem. There's 86 billion neurons and 84 billion other kinds of, there's just tons and tons of different kinds of cells. There's a new atlas that came out that there's 3,300 different types of neurons or something like that. So it's really complicated, but it's trivial compared to what's beyond that. It's just a projection of a much deeper reality. And we're going to have to reverse engineer neuroscience and understand the dynamical systems outside of space-time that project into what we call brains and neurons. And so I think we need the neuroscience, but I agree with you that to say the neuroscience is it, and that will give us the answer, absolutely not. Yeah. It gives us the data that we need to explain with a theory that's completely outside of space-time.
So Don, throughout your extensive research and exploration in consciousness, I wonder, have there been moments or periods of introspection where you question or maybe reevaluated your own beliefs and theory? How have such moments, if they occur, influence your idea, Don?
Yes. I came into this research fundamentally with a physicalist framework in mind. I was raised in the Christian church, but I think all of us are physicalists and materialists just by nature. We are identified with our bodies. We're afraid of the death of our bodies. We are physicalists deep down, no matter what we say. And so I was a physicalist, and I consciously and unconsciously brought that to my research. But when my own research began to tell me that maybe everything that I was seeing was something that I was making up, that maybe this is just a headset. When that happened to me in 1986, we were working on this mathematical model of consciousness, and in 1986, I still remember the moment when it occurred to me what our math was saying, that basically this is just a headset, and everything I'm seeing is just a virtual object on my headset. It was just such a shock to me that I had to sit down for a while. It was just overwhelming. But I realized that my own mathematical modeling was forcing me to that conclusion. And later on, when I found that evolutionary game theory says the same thing, and then when I find the physicists are saying that space-time is doomed, those are like big moments for me where my whole physicalist framework that in some sense, we're almost born believing in physicalism. Having that stripped off has been quite a shock to the system. So I do spend a lot of time in meditation, partly to grapple with all this stuff that's so counterintuitive and so counter to my own emotional orientation.
Except in my case, in Don's case, it was breakthroughs, new knowledge, new paradigms. In my case, the tradition was giving me these understandings, but I just didn't get them. There was a deeper and deeper understanding of what I had always been reading and always been hearing. Clarity came over the years.
I started my journey last year because I have experience. That's why I start with Don, and I start with Bernardo, and then I start with quite a few philosophers before I get to here with Swami Ji, and yeah, I can resonate with Don completely. Yeah. I'm going to move on to a very quick question. So to both of you, so how do you differentiate between what is objective real and our perceptions of reality? Because we still live in this reality realm, isn't it?
So the way we would deal with this question in Advaita Vedanta is, you ask the question, what is the criterion of truth? If we keep making claims about this is ultimately real, that's an appearance, immediately you have to define how do you define truth? How do you define reality?
Yeah.
And in Indian philosophy, we have multiple definitions of reality, of truth, criterion of truth. I'll just put before you two theories or two criteria of reality. One, the Buddhist criterion, one, the Advaita Vedanta criterion. Then the contrast will make it clear what we are talking about. So the question is, how do you decide what's truth? The Buddhist criterion is practical efficacy. If a thing works, has effects as it is expected to have, there's water and you drink it and it quenches your thirst. It feels cold and it quenches your thirst. So it's water, it's real. Whereas the water in a mirage is not real, because when you go there and try to use it the way it's supposed to be used, it doesn't work. So you clearly realize it's not there. That's practical efficacy is the criterion of truth. If it works, it's true. And it's amazing what a resonance it has with modern American philosophy, the whole school of pragmatism, William James, Charles Peirce, and everybody. Now, the Advaita Vedanta says to this that, look, practical efficacy cannot be a foolproof criterion of truth. You could drink water and it quenches your thirst, and the next moment you could wake up and it was all a dream. So the water was in a dream and your thirst was in a dream and experience of drinking water was in a dream. It was cancelled. So Advaita Vedanta criterion of truth is non-cancellability. So the classic example of a snake and a rope. You realize it's not a snake. Oh, it is a rope. I mistook it for a rope. That which cannot be cancelled is real. Now, what is it that can never be cancelled on principle? And Advaita Vedanta says all cancellation depends on consciousness. You have to be conscious of an error that seemed to be true. Now you have to be conscious of, you realize, oh, that was not true. This is true. Now, the only thing that cannot be cancelled in this picture is consciousness itself. Because to have the experience of cancellation of consciousness, you still need consciousness. Consciousness cannot be cancelled. This is kind of a distant echo of Descartes' I think, therefore I am. The only one thing that cannot be doubted. So yes, this is the criterion. Everything is a perception to consciousness. Consciousness itself is revealed to itself as the ultimate truth, the ground of all perception. Keeping the proviso that as far as our practical life is concerned, you're driving a car, going out shopping, all of that works within the headset using Don's paradigm, the example metaphor. All of that has to be given due importance. You can't dismiss it as a dream. Within the realm of perception, within the realm of projection, science works, common sense works, art, religion, all of them have their spheres of operation. But all of it is grounded in consciousness, but as understood in the Advaita Vedanta, consciousness in itself, the non-dual reality.
I like that. I think that's a very, very good answer. And I would just add a couple little things from the scientific point of view. There's a technical notion called local realism, which is a particle satisfies local realism if it has a definite value of its properties like position, momentum, and spin, and those properties have definite values even if they're not observed. And the locality is that's the realism part. The locality says they have influences that propagate through space-time no faster than the speed of light. And local realism appears to be false. I mean, the Nobel Prize in 2022 just last year was for empirical confirmation of predictions of quantum theory that local realism is false. So we have, from a scientific point of view, it is still some controversy. There are some scientists who, like I think Sabina Hassenfelder, who would say it's not really local realism that's false. It's really maybe the superdeterminism is true or something like that. So I mean, there's still some debate to be had, but at least the question has a precise statement in physics, and experimental tests are being done on it, and it appears that local realism, in the sense of local realism, is false. And maybe Sabina will be able to show that superdeterminism takes care of it, and local realism doesn't have to go out the window. My guess is that local realism is false and superdeterminism may be true both. So it's not either or. What that means is that if the particle doesn't have a position when it's not observed, it's not there, right? If you don't have a position, you're not there. So it's not real in the sense. If I'm wearing a VR headset and I'm playing Grand Theft Auto, and I see in my VR set a red Ferrari to my right, well, that red Ferrari only exists when I look and render it on my headset. As soon as I look away, there is no red Ferrari. There's not in the supercomputer that's running the game. There's no red Ferrari anywhere. So the red Ferrari has a position and a color and a shape only when I look. So local realism is false for the red Ferrari because the red Ferrari is just a headset symbol that pops up and renders when I look. And that's what it looks like physics is telling us about space-time. Particles are like the red Ferrari. They don't have a position or momentum and spin when you don't look because you haven't rendered them yet. So you have to render them in your headset. So that's one way in which we could say that realism in the typical sense is false, and which would agree with what you were saying. And there's another, I'll just put out a little distinction between sometimes the word real, when we use the word real, we use it in two different senses casually. One is to say it's real if it exists even when no one looks. So we might say the moon is real because it exists even when no one looks. Although I just gave an argument for why it doesn't, but still someone might say that, right? So that would be one sense of real. But another sense of real might be like I have a real headache and my headache is real. Well, would the headache exist if no one perceived it? Well, of course not. It's actually because you perceive it as a headache that you have a headache. So, but you wouldn't want to say that it's not real because it doesn't exist when no one perceives it. So we use the word real in these two different senses, and it apparently no object is real we think about the moon being real in the first sense, it exists even when no one perceives it, but we're going to have to give that up because space-time is doomed. So essentially the moon is like a headache, and so they only exist when you perceive them, and that makes the distinction between public objects and private objects more problematic.
Yeah.
Right. We say the moon is a public object because you and I are both seeing the same moon. Well, actually, we're not seeing the same moon. You're seeing the moon in your headset, and I'm seeing the moon in my headset. You have a headache in your headset, and I have a headache in my headset. So the distinction between public and private objects actually dissolves when you realize that space-time is doomed.
That reminds me of a sub-school of Advaita Vedanta called Drishti Shrishtivada, which translates, you'd be excited to hear this, Don, which translates into seeing is projection. So the way they look at this entire universe is, as you see things, experience things, they are being rendered for that time, and then they disappear back into the limitless consciousness plus causality. But that's one sub-school here.
That's brilliant, because they came up with that before we had VR headsets. That's brilliant.
But it's much easier from the inside out perspective, because that's what it seems to be, the world,
Right.
Yeah.
Very, very exciting.
Yeah, the question, since it's a kind of inquiry into who you are, it's an inquiry, but you can also investigate it as a model, as an exercise. Is there any place where these two can ever meet? The logic of looking at oneself. This is my question, because the science and spirituality.
I think that was the theme of the whole discussion. I would look at it this way: if it meets, it's wonderful, but the understanding is more important than the actual meeting. It's good to have the dialogue so that there's cross-fertilization, as Don himself said, because of the super specialization in science, you have genetic scientists or cognitive scientists who don't know the latest stuff in particle physics, and you have particle physicists who don't know the latest stuff in particle physics and another area of particle physics. So this kind of conversation between philosophy, spirituality, science, I think it sort of cross-fertilizes and gives us new ways of looking at it, which may further help our present investigation itself. That's at the very minimum.
Yep, I agree, and I think it's in the nature of spiritual investigations and scientific investigations that they will always only just be perspectives. The spiritual traditions are very clear that everything we say is just pointers, and science, I think, is very, very clear that our theories are just theories, and we never will have a theory of everything. And that's part of who I am, is something that transcends any particular pointer or any particular scientific description. The investigation of who I am is, in principle, endless.
Yes, that's where, in classical meditation or inquiry, when the one inquiring or observing or witnessing has come to the end of inquiry, what is it that is inquiring after that?
I think that's a good question. I'll just start where Don left off and say that he said it's an endless quest. The way what Advaita would say at that point is, it's not endless, it has an end for you. When you find peace, you find that ground where you have transcended suffering. You can check for yourself that has it helped you to overcome suffering, that deep insight. And yet it is also not a clear end, because you are no longer able to state it. And see, an end to a scientific inquiry is when you are clearly able to state mathematically or otherwise what is it that you have found and make a proposition out of it. But by its very definition, being beyond concepts and beyond language, you cannot state it precisely. If you could, it would be an object of language, again something limited. So in that sense, it's endless. But for the inquirer, for you, Prakash, or for us, there is an end. What we started off with, transcendence of suffering, solution to the great mystery of universe, consciousness, and mind, there is an answer to that. But that answer is not formulated. You cannot formulate it in speech, but it will satisfy you. And there have been this whole tradition of mystics and people in every spiritual tradition who have found it, and they have, at least personally, they have found the end of their quest.
Well said.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Swami Ji. The question, I had difficulty to find differences, but I think I have spotted one, which is that obviously Don multiple times basically mentioned the sort of notion of incompleteness, that we can never through science reach a ultimate description of the final description or something. So it's going to be always a better and a better version of description. Now in non-duality, there is a famous description which is about Purnamadam, Purnamidam. So here actually completeness is described as the end. So this is a question to both of you. How do we have to reconcile these two, or will these two descriptions remain always separate? It's more or less in the direction of the whole discussion, but yeah, I'm curious about your reactions. Thank you.
I don't think the difference is as much as you make of it, because whether it is the Purnamada, the verse mantra you referred to, or when I said the ultimate reality is beyond limitations of time, space, and object, is it final? Advaita Vedanta would claim it is final, and there are other philosophies in the ancient Indian tradition which would oppose that. And I think what has been happening in Indian philosophy also is further and further refinements of some central insight. It's not that one of them was right and the other was wrong. They all got that insight, and that helped them to overcome suffering, that completed their spiritual project. But when they wanted to express it logically and put a framework on it, those frameworks can be improved upon. And even if I think Advaita is the final word, you can always ask me, so what is the final word? And I have to tell you that it's beyond language. So in that sense, it's not complete. It's still incomplete. Technically, it's you have not defined it within, and nor can you. You've just managed to show why it cannot be and should not be. Give a final label on it. Why language will fail. It's a little bit like Wittgenstein in the early Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, who says the world is all that is the case, and the limits of my language are the limits of the world. And then he goes on towards the end to say what lies beyond the world must be passed over in silence. So again, very evocative, but that's the answer I would give. Yeah.
Right. I would agree. I would just say maybe the same thing, just slightly differently, and just say that if you're going to do descriptions, then there's endless descriptions. But if you recognize that I am that reality and you embrace yourself without concepts and just be yourself, then there is the end of description, and there is an end in that sense, but then you can't really talk about it. But you know it in a sense that transcends any conceptual knowledge.
Don, you mentioned obviously that in your sort of work, there's no arrow of time, but still it is dynamic. And what is dynamic is probably the artifact of the headset itself. So-called, in my understanding, it sounded like ripples of mind or some kind of a philosophical explanation. Now, as a result of no arrow of time, obviously we'll have no entropy. So for me, the fundamental question here was, are you able to formulate mathematics where there would be no entropy as such in the whole of it? Or how do we, is this even a valid question? So I'm very fascinated if we are able to formulate mathematics where there would be zero entropy all through.
Right. So just a slight technical thing here. It's Markovian dynamics, and you can write down a Markovian dynamical system in which the dynamics is what they call stationary. And in that case, the entropy doesn't increase. It's not that there is no entropy, it's that the entropy doesn't increase. So the entropy is, so there is no arrow of time in terms of like a second law of thermodynamics in which the entropy is always increasing, and that gives you an arrow of time. But so it's straightforward to write down stationary Markov chains. It's no big deal. And those, the entropy doesn't increase, and so they don't have an entropic arrow of time. But it's a simple theorem, 3 or 4 line proof, a pretty straightforward proof, that if you take that stationary Markov dynamics and project it onto a dynamics that loses some information based on conditional probability, then that projected dynamics itself will have an arrow of time as an artifact of the projection process. And so I take that as that's the headset having a notion of time as an artifact of loss of information. If we had the full information, we wouldn't need the notion of time. We probably wouldn't need objects. We wouldn't need evolution by natural selection and competition. All those things are entirely artifacts of wearing a particular headset.
Yes. I mean, that was very fascinating because it sounds like basically when one is in meditation, when there is no Bayesian sort of things going on, right? When one is completely in first-person perspective, it sounded almost the same to me that when there is stationary, you mentioned a particular name, but yeah, it's a fascinating answer. Thank you. I see a lot of similarities here. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea.
If I can add an amusing side note to that, an entropy discussion reminded me of a very cute story by Isaac Asimov I read as a kid. It's called The Last Question. And basically the story is somebody asks a computer, can entropy be reversed? And the computer says there isn't enough data about it. And then the story goes on and on with succeeding generations of computers over millions. The story is set over billions of years. The computer just gets becoming more and more sophisticated till it becomes a cosmic mind. And the universe finally dies a heat death. There is nobody left. Finally, the computer gets the answer. And it restarts the arrow of time because it wants somebody to give the answer to it. The story ends with the computer saying, let there be light. And there was light.
That's a brilliant story. Yeah.
Brilliant story, really. Cute and very fascinating.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivy, for facilitating this wonderful speakers and thinkers. Highly appreciated encounter. And I have two questions at least. And the first is for Donald, because as I understood, the reasoning with evolution theory, and you come to these metaphors like, of course, the headset is well known, and the desktop, the icons on the desktop. I always think, why do you say at a certain point that one has to realize that the body is only an avatar? Because if you think about it, as the survival programmed evolution says, hey, stop, don't touch this vessel with a knife. This blood vessel, if you touch this blood vessel with a knife, this is very dangerous. Sorry for my words. And so don't think that this is completely consistent in a way, sorry, because if you think it to the end, it's not only icons, but knobs and sliders. And when we have objects and evolution has made us like this, then we have to listen to our illusions, so to speak, yeah, as a traditional philosopher would put it, illusions, because they are very useful illusions. Like, here is the brain, here's the heart, here are the blood vessels. Be careful, because your heart will pulse if you're in a dangerous situation, for instance. So why deny this, what Nietzsche would call the wisdom of the body? Why deny the body? Why deny that we only have one life and say it's just an avatar? Don't care so much about your shitty avatar. Your body is not so important. Because the religions have taught us that don't care so much about it, because you have an afterlife. So how can you bring together the scientific worldview, which you are still committed to, because you are often saying my colleagues are asking for predictions, and I totally understand it. What's the consequences? What's the advantage? What's the prediction? And so, on the other hand, you say, why should I care about my body? And this is a question about evolution and your consistency of the theory. And the other is, what is the way to go? Because you are meditating. Of course, Swami is also in meditation, and you're masters in it, probably. And then traditionally, we have also art and poetry and reading ancient texts to get some wisdom. So we have different gates to knowledge. And so how is it put together? Is it like a mixture for you? Or would you say, like when we had the Wittgenstein point here 5 minutes ago, in a way, you stop the description, you stop the reasoning, you stop the rationality, and you have to accept it that the rationality is good for going to Mars or to the moon, but for your existential questions, rationality will not be the vehicle to bring you the step to the wisdom. So this was the second question. Thank you for listening.
So to deal with these two questions, first, I know that Don has a very specific answer to the question about not touching the blood vessel with the knife, though the knife and the blood vessel both might be appearances in consciousness, but you still don't do that. He has an answer, and he'll answer that. From a Vedantic perspective, or not just Vedantic, any spiritual perspective, both the Abrahamic religions or the Indian religions, all of them, or Chinese religions, all of them will tell you to listen to the wisdom of the body. I think Nietzsche was rhetorical. So in order to prove a point, and he had a wonderful point, but in order to do that, he downplayed the wisdom of religion. Sort of rhetorically, I think. So every religion, in different language, in different metaphor, with different theology, will tell you to respect the wisdom of the body, the wisdom of the mind, the wisdom of society, of family, of community and nation, all of that. but they are not ends in themselves. So this is what distinguishes any religion from non-religion. Any religion will have an element of the transcendental. It's this old atheist Freud. He was wise in this way. He didn't believe in any religion, but he said religion is characterized by the transcendental. So every religion, every spiritual tradition, whether talking about God or Buddha nature or the emptiness or the Tao or Brahman, talks about something that transcends material reality, including material body. That's all. No, none of them tell you not to eat or to kill yourself or neglect yourself to the point. There have been religious practitioners who have done that, and unwisely so. One of our Swamis used to put it this way: don't abuse the horse you cannot dismount from. I mean, don't abuse the horse anyway, but don't abuse the horse you cannot dismount from. As long as you have the body, there is the wisdom of the body, as you said. I think an answer comes from this anecdote. It's a real story. One of our early Swamis, Swami Turiyananda, in the early 20th century, a great non-dualist, when he was talking about non-dual Vedanta to a group of pilgrims in the Himalayas, and they were sitting around a fire at night and talking about philosophy. One of the gentlemen, in great irritation, said to the Swami, "Look, if you think all of this is an appearance in consciousness, I challenge you to thrust your hand into this bonfire." And the Swami got up in great excitement and he said, "Yes, I will. And my hand will be burnt. But I, the witness consciousness, I am untouched by the fire." And he was rushing towards the fire. Luckily, people caught him and pulled him back. But this shows the difference, that nobody's denying that the hand, if there's a fire, the hand will get burnt. So anyway, so Don's here. The question about the knife touching cutting your blood vessels with the knife, it's an illusion, then why don't you do it?
Right. Well, no, I agree with what you were just saying. That is the right answer. I could maybe just put it in other words. When you're playing a game, you have to play by the rules of the game. We're in a VR headset game right now, and if you want to stay in the headset and play the game, don't destroy your avatar. If you destroy your avatar in the game, if you let it get shot up in the game, then game over and you're out of the avatar. So while I'm here, but it's one thing to take care of your avatar so you don't get knocked out of the game. It's another thing to identify with your avatar, and those are two different things. So don't identify with your avatar is great because it tells you that when the game is over, it's not game over for you period. It's just game over for that game, not for you and your consciousness. So yeah, respect your body, treat it well as long as you want to stay in the game. But also when your body gets cancer or gets heart attack or whatever it is that's going to kill you, to disidentify from the body and realize that you're just taking off a headset.
Yeah. Hi, Don. So hi, Swami. So my basic question is that what is the smallest problem that we can tackle, to answer some of these questions? So in my opinion, it is basically like how we imagine a sparrow, how we imagine something in our head. See, in our inner space, we have all the freedom to do whatever we want. So that's also a field of reality, like external reality. And because I can create a sparrow in my head, and I can basically extend that logic and I can say, I have created the whole of reality. But I here is not, of course, the body mind. It's awareness or consciousness or whatever we call it as. The point is like, how can we convert this into a proper scientific experiment kind of a thing, where basically we need to explain all aspects which are involved in it. If we just limit to brain, for example, it won't work, right? Because it will be incomplete, because we are not considering everything that's participating in creating up that sparrow in your head. Right. And of course, it's not just accessing memory to create a sparrow, the whole action of creating a sparrow. And so in my opinion, the smallest experiment that we can create and literally force, the humanity to really explain it 100% is something that, no, I just wanted to point that it's extremely important to problem. Consciousness is the important problem and people are not giving importance to it. And I just hope that by creating it the smallest possible experimentation or whatever, because we say that when we move our hand, actually it's the consciousness that moves the hand, right? A system cannot self-control itself unless you assume superdeterminism. So I just wanted to say that something like that needs to be done, is what I feel.
I would just respond that the scientific community is now taking consciousness quite seriously, and that there are hundreds of researchers, first-rate researchers, many of them my friends and colleagues, who are brilliant and are working very, very hard on the problem, and they're realizing how hard the problem is. And so I agree that, and from my point of view, to make the kind of progress that I want to make in this field, I need to show that a theory of consciousness outside of space-time can make predictions like gluon and quark momentum distributions inside the proton. It can make precise predictions that are correct, that match the data. That's when science will take consciousness outside of space-time as a very interesting, and not before. They won't, until we can do something like that. There's no beef, and they won't be terribly interested.
No beef. Okay.
From a spiritual perspective, it has always been like a community of believers who believe in a certain worldview, but that doesn't work too well nowadays, because the worldview, at least for educated thinking people, no matter what they might believe in, the worldview is constructed by science.
Right.
And so if the original question was, how would you get people of the world to accept the primacy of consciousness? In that case, it has to come pretty much through science, not through, say, just Advaita Vedanta. Not everybody in the world is. The Advaita Vedanta works, or any spiritual tradition works in two ways. Either you buy into it, you believe it, or you pursue it as an inquiry and you know it. But that already presupposes you are interested and you are inquiring into it and you're practicing, and then finally you get to know it.
And not the atoms, molecules, or like protons, etc., etc. Because everything is otherwise just a projection. It writes from the abstract reality.
Scientists won't be quite persuaded, because they do have their own ideas about what imagination is. They have a notion of what you might call generate and test. So they have their own computational ways of trying to talk about creativity and imagination and so forth. So what we really need to do is to show that there's a theory of consciousness outside of space-time that can do something that they can't do with any of their theories inside space-time. That's the only way to really get them to take consciousness quite seriously.
Thank you, Ivy, for organizing this, and for the speakers. So my question is about emergence and complexity, and I'll try to make this brief. So it's often said that like physics explains chemistry and chemistry explains biology or geology or something like that. Maybe explains that chemistry is consistent with quantum mechanics. Nobody with complete knowledge of quantum mechanics would ever like predict the periodic table, or maybe part of it, but they certainly wouldn't predict, complicated protein folding and things like that. But all that complicated protein folding is completely consistent with quantum mechanics, and so the same could be true about biology and geology and all these different levels of science that kind of get to different levels of complexity. But no biologist would ever say chemistry is doomed. Like that would be sort of silly, right? Like, so I feel like when you say something like space-time is doomed, you're sort of, I don't know, you're being sensationalist. It is emergent, perhaps. Actually, we're not sure, right? But it sort of seems like it is. And 10 to the negative 33 or whatever the number is, that's a really small distance. Like you can make it seem like there's reason to think that there's some connection between that space scale and where we are now. But if you think that, like what I guess by what mechanism would something on that scale affect something on our scale? So I just think that the distance between, say, quantum mechanics and consciousness, you're really banging both ends of the scale. Like consciousness, our brains are the most complicated thing we know of in the universe, and the complaint that we can't tell the difference between the smell of garlic and mint it seems like an odd complaint. And if anybody ever did explain it, it would simply shift to, well, what's the difference between mint and cilantro? So it seems like a moving scale that can never like these questions like, what is it like to fill in the blank? They seem designed to not have answers. They seem designed to be revered, not to ever answer. So I just feel like, can you comment on like where exactly, what's your problem with emergence? I feel like there's a lot we don't understand. That is certainly true. But to say that like science has failed to explain or can't explain imagination. It's a question that you wouldn't ask of other fields. It seems to me. So, can you fill in your thoughts on complexity and emergence? Thank you.
Sure, great question. And so space-time is doomed isn't a phrase that I made up. It's David Gross, the winner of the Nobel Prize for his work on the quantum chromodynamics, wrote that in the 2005 paper in honor of Einstein's centenary of special relativity. He said, "Thank you, Einstein, for space-time. Wonderful, wonderful century, but space-time is doomed." And he went on to explain why he and several other physicists like Ed Witten and Nathan Seiberg and Andrew Strominger and more recently Nima Arkani-Hamed, all these high-energy particle physicists are saying, or theoretical physicists are saying, space-time is doomed. And so I'm a cognitive scientist. I'm not the one who came up with that. It's the physicist. And if you want to see why the physicists are saying this, there's an easy way to there's a great set of lectures by Nima Arkani-Hamed. And if you just Google Nima, which is Nima, Harvard Lecture 1, if you just Google that phrase, Nima Harvard Lecture 1, you will find a graduate class that Nima Arkani-Hamed gave at Harvard in 2019, the fall semester of 2019. And it's some like 27 lectures. And he will explain to you in great detail why space-time has to be doomed, why quantum theory itself cannot be fundamental and has to arise from something. It's going to arise with space-time, as he says, joined at the hip from a much deeper theory of something outside of space-time, not curled up inside the dimensions of space-time, but completely outside of space-time. So if you want to see, not from a cognitive scientist, secondhand, but from a physicist firsthand, Google Nima Harvard Lecture 1, and you can just listen to all of his 27 lectures, and he explains why space-time is doomed. And why the serious physicists in high energy particle physics are now looking for new structures outside of space-time and finding them, like amplitude hedron, decorated permutations, and cosmological polytopes. So this is not a cognitive scientist waving his hands and trying to be sensational. This is a serious class, a semester-long class at Harvard for graduate students who are trying to push the field forward. And the other part of the question, that was the space-time is doomed. The other part of the question was, it was about, I forget, prompt me on that one. It was about reductionism, I think.
Emergence and complexity.
Oh, emergence, yeah. And the question about, can they get theories that explain, the taste of chocolate or smell of garlic? So here's the reason why I bring that question up to my colleagues and peers. They have proposed that they are going to start with, say, a theory of the orchestrated collapse of quantum states of neuronal microtubules, and they're going to explain specific conscious experiences. That's what they're proposing to do. Or they're going to start with integrated information systems, the causal architectures, and they're going to explain the emergence of conscious experiences. So all I'm doing when I say this is saying, great, you proposed that you're going to start with integrated information and you're going to explain conscious experiences. So has your science done anything? What experience can you explain? Oh, nothing. There's nothing on the table. And in fact, what's so striking about this is they all say that they're going to explain conscious experiences. None of them explains even one conscious experience. And Steven Pinker, so he was talking about global workspace theory, but he says we're going to have to stipulate. So we have this global workspace, and he really liked the global workspace, but the connection with specific conscious experiences, we're going to have to stipulate. And that connection. And I agree with Steve. I mean, Steve is absolutely right. They have to stipulate it right now, but it's not one stipulation. They have to stipulate a connection for mint. They have to stipulate a connection for chocolate, for vanilla. In other words, it's not just one stipulation. There are millions and millions of stipulations that their theories can't explain, so they have to stipulate. So my attitude, when I put this question out to them, and I've done this in person to Giulio Tononi for integrated information theory and Stuart Hameroff for his orchestrated collapse of quantum states of microtubules, and they both have said can't do it, and that's fine. I mean, but I'm only asking them because they said they were going to do it, and that's what they were going to do, and they can't do it. And so that's why I'm putting out that question to them. So,
yeah, I will thank you very much for the opportunity. Pranam to both Swamiji and Vinod. I have two questions. My first question to Swamiji. In Advaita Vedanta, there seems to be unbridgeable gap between Paramarthika and Vyavaharika. As we say, the other part is illusion, and both seems to be never meet. Will it lead to ivory tower philosophy? Is my first question. And my question to Donald is, we read philosophy starts where science ends. Your opinion. Thank you.
So the question about two levels of truth. Paramarthika, the absolute or ultimate level, which is pure consciousness, existence, consciousness, bliss. And the entire display of this world, this individual being and this world, our life in it, being a lower level of truth and appearance. The reality is Brahman, the appearance is this world and our lives in it. Basically, using Don's metaphor of the headset, our life outside the headset and what we see in through the headset. He says that is there an unbridgeable gap between the two? If there is, then this ultimate level of truth, Brahman, becomes ivory tower philosophy and has no connection to life as we live it. No, there are not two truths actually. This whole paradigm of two truths, ultimate truth and relative truth, is again a framework helping us to deal with it, to come to grasp with the truth. Notice, even when we speak about truth and reality and appearance, reality and appearance, the rope is the reality and the snake is the appearance. There is at all times, there is only one reality, that's the rope. It just is a problem that it appears to us as a snake. These are not unbridgeably separated. It is the rope itself, in its own nature, in knowledge, in understanding, it's a rope, and in appearance, sometimes we think it's a snake or something else. So there are not two realities. There is only one reality. And when you, for example, when you become enlightened, Advaita Vedanta would say, not that you realize that all this is false and there is some reality called Brahman, which is the ultimate reality. No, you realize that you are Brahman. And indeed, everything is Brahman. So the appearance continues, but now it's the appearance of that reality. Yeah.
Great. And the question of does science begin where philosophy gives up, I guess, or leaves off? Historically, many sciences came out of philosophy. Philosophers worked on natural philosophy for a long time, and when it finally got precise and mathematical enough, it became what we call physics. But it was first natural philosophy. So there is this history in which we first deal with issues philosophically, but as the philosophers make real progress and we start to get very rigorous tools, then all of a sudden, we get some breakthrough, like Newton's laws or whatever of physics, and all of a sudden, okay, now it becomes a very specialist field because you have to really know this mathematics and study the implications of that mathematics and so forth. So that does happen, but I don't think that entails that there's a boundary between physics or science and philosophy. Or in fact, my experience is that there's a lot of crosstalk between them. We even in my school here at University of California, Irvine, we have a department called Logic and Philosophy of Science, and it's physicists mostly studying quantum theory and physics, working with philosophers in physics, and they're talking across the disciplines, trying to make sure that they're conceptually clear as well as getting things mathematically right and so forth. And so I have a joint appointment. I'm in the cognitive science department, but also in the computer science department and in philosophy and in logic and philosophy of science. And so I myself am trying to bridge cognitive science on the one hand and philosophical issues on the other hand. So I don't see that one stops and the other one starts. It's rather that there's an interchange, and it's very profitable for those who actually look at both sides.
Thank you, Don. Judge Advaita, are you happy with that?
Thank you, Donald. Thank you, Swamiji. Ivy, if you allow, I have one small
Yes,
question. If you permit me.
quickly. Yes, quickly.
Swamiji, I have one more question. See, whether grace of Guru and grace of God is must for Advaita Jnana. Thank you.
Technically, yes, but the answer is also that the winds of grace are always blowing. Sri Ramakrishna used to live on the bank of the Ganges, on the bank of the Ganga, and you would see these little boats floating along the river with the raised sails. So he says the winds of grace are always blowing, but you have to raise your sail to catch that wind.
Nice.
Jajavira?
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we move on to Curious?
Thank you for the opportunity. So, but I'll straight go to the question. So I have got two questions. One question for Donald. So Donald, my question is this regarding the collapse of wave function. Now, Copenhagen interpretation, it is the measurement which causes the collapse of the wave function. I'm saying in double quotation, right? Indispensable without consciousness, or rather, or like the von Neumann's interpretation is the consciousness which causes the collapse. Now, would you give one one argument, let's say, where this is very much required? So this would be my question for you. And for Swamiji, my question is this. Donald mentioned a couple of minutes back that about the in last 2022 or 21, the Nobel Prize in Physics went to the physicist who has proven that the universe is locally not determined. It is false. It is no longer objectively real. My question to you is this. So in one aspect of Vedanta or any of the Indian spirituality where you see a lot of convergence with modern physics, and which you can see, which you think, in your opinion, where further work can be done and further it can be further broken down and somewhere it can be converged with the physics. That would be my question for you, Swamiji. Thank you.
I think one way to think about this measurement problem is you have the Schrodinger equation, which is a linear partial differential equation, which describes the evolution of the state of a particle when no one is looking, when it's not being observed. That's a linear, again, partial differential equation. Then when you make a measurement, you get a single value, right? The spin is up or the spin is down, for example, or the position is such and such. Now, it turns out that the Schrodinger equation can't do that. You cannot, the Schrodinger evolution will not do that. So whatever is going on in the measurement process, it's not the Schrodinger evolution. You cannot, it doesn't work. So now some people will say, well, no big deal, decoherence. So many physicists will say there's decoherence. So decoherence takes care of the problem, but it doesn't. That's actually a mistake. Decoherence will take you from a pure quantum state to a mixed quantum state. That's true. It will take you from a pure state to a mixed state. It will not take you to a single outcome. Decoherence cannot do that. So decoherence does not explain the measurement problem at all. It's not a solution. So now what's interesting is what this means is that in the measurement process, we're talking about some kind of macroscopic measuring system and an observer that cannot be reduced to the particles that they're made of. Because if they could, then we could find it with the Schrodinger evolution, right? So the Schrodinger evolution doesn't work for these macroscopic measuring systems. That's the real measurement problem, right? That whatever the macroscopic observer or measurement system is, it cannot be described by the Schrodinger equation. And that's why the measurement problem is so difficult. Now, there are some like the cubists. Cubism is a view where they say that the quantum state is just the state of belief of an observer or of an agent. And that's closer to what I'm saying. But when you ask them, so Chris Fuchs, who's one of the authors of this theory, a friend of mine, when I ask him or talk with him about it, he says, it's not my job to give you a theory of what the agent is. I'm just saying that quantum mechanics is a description of the agent's beliefs and what the agent does. But I don't know what an agent is, and I'm not going to tell you what an agent is. So that's what I'm doing. I'm saying, okay, well, quantum mechanics seems to need an agent because the Schrodinger evolution won't do it and decoherence won't do it. So let me write down a mathematical dynamics of conscious agents and then show that I can get, quantum mechanics as a projection. But what Nima points out in his Harvard class that I mentioned earlier is that space-time is doomed, and with it, quantum mechanics is doomed. Quantum mechanics is going to be joined at the hip, he says, with space-time as emergent from something deeper. And this is really sort of underlined by the work of Chris Fuchs and Robert Speckens, where they point out that many of the interesting things about the weirdness of quantum mechanics, so no cloning theorem, superposition, entanglement, all of these weirdness things about quantum mechanics are really just symptoms of partial information. It's epistemic lack of information that leads to these effects. And if space-time is a headset, that's what we're saying. There's lack of information. You have a projection of reality onto a little headset. You've lost information. And as a result, we get the mathematics of quantum mechanics, which has these weirdnesses. And all the weirdnesses are just saying space-time is a headset. And quantum mechanics is a description of the lack of information that we're getting in that headset. And by the way, in terms of the depth of that headset, some people might be impressed with 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. I might be impressed with 10 to the minus 33 trillion centimeters resolution, but 10 to the minus 33, we got cheated. 10 to the minus 33 trillion, now I'm impressed, but not 10 to the minus 33.
I think the work that is being done right now, the new interest in consciousness studies, and the cutting edge work in particle physics, all of this is very interesting to people who are interested in Indian philosophy. It's all very interesting. We don't be in a hurry to say that we have met or we have found congruence, but there are similarities. Why I'm interested in is the things which I believe or I understand. The new science which is coming up can throw more light on it, and I can understand it better from different angles and entirely new paradigms. The earlier question about philosophy and science, it reminded me of this very nice series of videos you have on YouTube where scientists explain advanced scientific concepts at 5 levels. It's very interesting. Calculus, black holes, quantum mechanics. You explain it to a middle school kid. You explain it to a high school kid. You explain it to an undergrad, a PhD student, and one of your colleagues. And what I noticed was when they're talking to little kids, it's mostly analogies and metaphors. And when they're talking to the undergrads and the PhD students, it gets very technical. It gets mathematical. It gets very technical. But when they're talking to their own colleagues, it gets philosophical. They already understand the technicalities. Then it becomes a question of interpretation, where philosophy comes in. Right?
Hello, Don. Namaste, Swami Ji. Great to hear you guys talk. Swami Ji, I've been hearing to you for a long time, and I'm delighted to talk to you today. My first question for Swami Ji is, if consciousness is all permeable, then why does death of the body and one's sense of being? And my second question is, if you may allow, there is this quote from Fernando Pessoa, a Portuguese poet and a writer, who wrote, "And I myself am the center that exists only because the geometry of the abyss demands it. I am the nothing around which all this spins. I exist so that it can spin. I am the center that exists only because every circle has one." So, Swamiji, can one relate this quote to Advaita Vedanta in any way? Thank you.
Yeah. Pessoa is very Vedantic. I've found some philosophers, most recently Janardhan Ganeri, who has taken Pessoa very, very seriously. Yeah. So it's only when we do not appreciate the real nature of consciousness, then physical death seems to be the end of everything. Why just physical death? Anesthesia, coma, or just deep sleep every night. It seems to be nothing. It seems to be a blank. Yet we are assured, we are told that if you appreciate consciousness for what it is, in that case, the blankness of deep sleep or the utter, even deeper blankness of anesthesia would still be an appearance of nothing to consciousness. So you wouldn't actually see at that point, you cannot think that I am consciousness, which we can do that now. If the mind shuts down, you cannot think. But when the mind kicks back in again, when it works, the difference between us, when we don't know, when we are not enlightened, when we look back, when we imagine what deep sleep or death or anesthesia looks like, you think it's nothing. For the enlightened one, it would be a presentation of nothing to consciousness.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Take care, Don. Thank
You too.
you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.